Okay, super. So this is the second of the Journeys podcasts in Shallal. And my name's Jo Willis, and I'm interviewing Alan Munden, which I'm very excited about, as always. So we're just going to give a little audio description of ourselves first, and then we'll jump straight into chatting. So I'm a now 60-year-old woman with grey hair, blue glasses, slightly olive skin, pink scarf, black top, and I'm in front of sort of some cream and white wood shutters.
I'm Alan, I'm 67, although I think I look quite a lot younger than that. I've got a big old beard, so I'm due a haircut. It's sort of peppery grey, and I'm wearing glasses, wire glasses, and I'm sat in my house in Falmouth with pots and pans behind me.
Super, thanks, Al. So the idea of journeys has lots of reasons and lots of layers to it, like I was talking to Al about. But I just wanted to unpick journeys a little bit and talk about people migration. And I feel that that's a really important issue for our time. And it's nice to hear about personal things to do with that. And so the journey that I'm really interested in is that Al's mother was, I think I was reading last night, the last of the Kinder transport group to leave and to arrive in England. And she spent some of her time talking about it. And then Al and his wife Jude and lots of their friends started up Falmouth and Penryn Welcome Refugee Families. So I think it's just really interesting to see how I'm interested in your mother's experience and your understanding of that, and whatever else. I'll just let you talk.
Yeah. So the history of my mum, who's Liesl Munden, ní Heilbronner, she was born in 1924 in, I guess it was in Düsseldorf. She certainly lived in Düsseldorf, and was a much loved only child. She had a sister who died before she was born, in her early teens, or maybe 10 or so. So when Liesl arrived later, she was much wanted and loved, and to elderly parents. So I have lots and lots. I have an extraordinary photo record and document record and object record, bizarrely, of her and her life in Germany. Possibly more of that later, because that's interesting. I think that objects came with her afterwards at huge cost, and they were slightly ridiculous, kind of silver teapots and bourgeois markers. Anyway, digress a bit. So she, after Kristallnacht in 1938, her parents decided to get her out. And then she, interestingly, so I'll bang straight into the Kindertransport and that story as much as I know it. So the British government, after a lengthy debate, decided in their largesse at the time to allow 10,000 Jewish children to the UK. By then they knew the outlook wasn't good. I don't think they knew. Nobody knew in detail, but broadly they knew what was coming, and whether or not they thought they were just giving sanctuary to 10,000 children, a bit like evacuating children from London into the country, I don't know. I'd have to read Hansard and go into the weeds of that, but certainly they allow. I always have. This is always. It's been promulgated as a great. It's England has a great history of allowing refugees and helping refugees. I would sort of argue that in a way, in as much as they didn't allow the parents of those children, specifically because they believed that those parents would take jobs. So that was a financial decision. And in doing that, they split up. They saved children, undoubtedly saved 10,000 children, but they also blew apart those families. So for good or ill. But it seems, to me, that's kind of overlooked in the discourse I'm not
When
by everybody.
I started looking, because I don't know much about it either, and I've just heard that it was a wonderful thing, like you're saying, at quite a shallow level, and I haven't looked deeply at it. And last night I started reading about it, and I thought, this is very complex, and I have to look at it, because it was complex getting it through Parliament. It didn't seem like it was straightforward at all. And I think things are always far more complicated than we realise when you start peeling them back.
Yeah, and it's very easy to damn the government for not allowing that. And I think that's where I'm going to stay, really.
I think this is all fine. I mean, this is just looking at it. We don't have to resolve anything. And I'm very interested in just your perspective, because I think when you've lived close to something, you have a different perspective. Do you know what I mean? When you're like, oh, it's great, 10,000 children came over, isn't it lovely? And as I was reading it last night, I was thinking like, oh my gosh, the heartache, the pain, the decision to send your child, to just hand them over, the trauma. And most children, I think, it seemed all right, but not all of them. Not all of them found families. It's much more nuanced as you get closer in.
Yeah, and you had to have, I think, £50 sterling, and I'm not sure if you had to have someone to go to, but it certainly helped.
Yeah, I don't think you had to, but it would have helped. But yes, I do remember.
But I think that the families, they had to have found families that were prepared to come forward to sort of adopt you for that time. Like the Attenboroughs, I think. The Attenboroughs' parents, David and Richard's parents, did that. So, yes, that's complicated. I mean, it is, for me, and in the sort of familial history, as it was mythologized for us, and I think generally the Kindertransport, it is that moment of dislocation and separation that is so potent, and has engendered, books and drama, and it's that moment of dislocation from parent to child, and it's the disparity of knowledge, where the parent probably knew that it was a final farewell, maybe. Whereas, and I'm sure most of the children were told it was a holiday and that we'll see you soon. I know for my mother that was the dynamic, and I'm sure, why wouldn't you? Of course you would tell your children that. So there is this personal, and I imagine it's a wider mythology among kinder and among people who are interested in it, of a moment, and it's a moment at railway stations. It's particular to that mode of transport, of separation. So that's the ground zero. That's emotionally, mythologically, and actually probably, and for my mother and for me, that moment is huge. I'm sure it was huge, but in memory, it remains the foundation story of separation. So she had that separation. She thought she was going on holiday. She went to see Uncle Julius, who was going to be her guardian. She had her bag and her label around her neck. She was 14, and she got on a train, and she went via the Hook of Holland. And I think it was quite a stressy train ride, you can imagine, with babies. They stopped in Holland and were given food and friendship by Dutch women on that platform. But I don't know how conscious they were, but again, the myth is that train could have been turned back at any time.
Well, I did read that. I think I read on the pipeline thing that it was one of the last trains. And I did read, as I was going down, it said, one of the trains actually didn't get through. I think 2 days later, there was a load of children who were sent off 2 days after. It's the third
Wow,
thing.
I didn't know that.
They didn't get through. So it was very close.
Right.
Very close, whether you got through, wasn't it? And they took them via Holland because that was an easier route.
Yeah. I think for my mum, and it carried on in her life in Germany, she was quite sporty and adventurous. And I think it was, and I'm sure her parents would have framed it like that, it was an adventure. It was a scary adventure, but some of the best adventures are. So there is always that. And it puzzled my mum that for all her life, she felt guilt that she may have enjoyed it too much. And her life in England
Yes.
out of this, wasn't even late Victorian, it looks like a mid-Victorian strictured life that she had as a overloved only child.
Yeah.
In this kind of frumpy, the pictures are amazing. There are these kind of big German Frau lines, and guys in smoking pipes in waistcoats. And it was another age, but in Berlin you'd have been, being a flapper or something. It was, so she was having a time of her life, not the time of her life, but she was, I think, because she didn't know what was coming down the line and what had motivated her parents to do that, she didn't share. That's the disparity at the station.
Yeah.
The kids were crying, they were lonely, but this was a temporary thing, and the parents, to varying degrees, knew what was coming. Interestingly, my grandparents really knew what was coming. My great grandparents. So my grandparents were Ludwig and Emma, and they were Liesl's parents. But this is a I call it a great story, because I'd like to get onto that, how I mythologize it and try to hook in to an emotion I don't feel kind of worthy of. I can't raise my game to the extremity of it. But they had Julius, who Liesl, who was Liesl's guardian in London. He was in London. He was a neighbour of my great grandparents, who had a big shop in Speyer, which is very close to Düsseldorf, famous sort of Jewish town, big Jewish community. And he had been taken to Auschwitz in 1938, and it wasn't ready. It wasn't fucking ready. So he was taken back to Speyer. And he very sensibly didn't stop at Speyer and carried on to London.
Yes.
But my great grandparents were at Speyer station. He leant out the window and said, "Raus, get out, leave," because he'd seen what the plan was. So that's why he was in London. And we found that out because about 7 years ago, and I'd like to talk about this if we've got time, we went to Speyer. We were invited to Speyer to lay Steppelstones, which is a biggest outdoor sculptural project in the world, I think. And it's these laying of these little bronze stones.
I've read about them. They're fantastic. Is it with the names of the people on each
Yeah,
stone?
it's outside the last place they were resident.
Yes.
And there are thousands of them. And Germans quite often raise funds. It's a huge contritional, hair shirt, sort of self-flagellating thing. And you can completely understand it, where they can raise funds, get this artist who just rocks up, doesn't say a word in his little van, has cast these stones, sets them in the pavement, and then disappears into the night. And the town, or the people who have commemorated those who were murdered, can do what they like with it. So we got invited, a random email, to come to as it turned out, to bear witness to their contrition. And that was quite an odd journey. But that's when we found out about Julius. People sort of melted from the street to talk to us, older people, and to share memories and stories. Quite extraordinary. But anyway, so that's why Julius was in London. And so to my mother's story, sorry, jumping around a bit, but
It's fine. It's fine. Well, families are like that, aren't they? And
yeah.
It's a lot of threads.
Yeah. So my mother came to England. She stayed with Julius, not for long, I don't think. She went to, and I guess Julius and my grandfather may have got money to fund this to the UK. She went to St. Leonard's, to a girls' boarding school in St. Leonard's, and had the best time, I think. Suddenly, you can imagine, she's exotic. She was very personable and a good girl. So she'd studied English. She'd had to not she was thrown out of the school in Germany and had to go to a Jewish school, the Lavne, I think it was called. So that was the beginning of all the legislation that marginalised the Jews. But again, she just went to another school and there were lots of other nice people there. I think that was her impression of it. I hope I don't do her disservice, but I think she was pretty oblivious.
I think you don't. How much do you know when you're young? You have no comparison, do you? You just do what you do, and as long as the world around you is fairly kind and fairly nice, you can be having horrible things around that you don't really affect your world, I think.
Well, there is a trope, isn't there? There was that. I haven't seen it. I tend not to watch sort of Holocaust porn, sort of film, but there was one where a father in the camps tried to weave a world of sort of beauty to protect his child.
Pajamas or something. I started watching. I couldn't actually manage that one. I can't do much like that.
Yeah. So that dynamic, I think, was at work. So she'd learned her English. So she had rather sweet broken English, I imagine, and she went down to St Leonard's for a year or so. Was it still in contact for years afterwards, decades afterwards, with one of the teachers there? And I imagine she had a fantastic time there. She certainly talks of it fondly. And then, this is a kicker, when war was declared, she was an enemy alien in the UK at 14 and had to move back to London. So she was wrenched from that school. And she tells the story that the policeman was in tears. And it was so obviously ridiculous.
Yes.
That someone in her position should be, have found safety and sanctuary and then be torn from that. So that is another kind of emblematic moment for her, as much as she did tell the story. So she then moved to London, back to London, and I think she lived in lodgings. Don't think she moved back with Judith, and then just took shorthand, became a typist and a secretary, worked for, and made friends. I'm a bit hazy on that period, but she had a friendship group which she kept all her life there. She was just very good at making friends all her life and making the best of it. So, and long story short, she married my dad. And she was quite young. He was 12 years older. And, the rest is me, my sister, and her fairly happy life in suburban London, really. But always that story came and went.
Well, just reintroduce the fact that Al is now in front of a green room instead of pots and pans in the kitchen. It's now in a green room. Yeah.
It's actually chroma green, so we can drop a different background in very badly.
I was going to say, it's like, absolutely.
Green screen. So, and I think so that in terms of how she then related to that journey through her life, my dad, I've always been puzzled by my dad being 12 years older and how they met and why they got together. And what sort of cultural value how damaged she might have been perceived to be as a German Jew by my dad, who was very Anglo-Saxon, sort of white working class, really quite poor. I think his background was quite tough, and he made, he educated himself and so he was quite a complicated man, and so I don't know how they got together and how they were perceived and how they perceive themselves as a couple. I really don't know that. I'd love to have investigated more, but I think that was probably we didn't have the language for that conversation. And it might not have been a comfortable one. But they had a marriage very typical of that generation, I think very gendered. She was always very conscious that she never knew she was never taught how to be a good wife or a good mother. She was aware that that part of her life was fractured.
Yes.
So when we were problematic teenagers, she bemoaned the fact that she had no personal experience as a daughter to be a mother to that experience.
When did she know that her parents had died? What age was she when she knew?
Yes, not.
One of the things I read was that virtually, when they did try to sort of re-find the parents, virtually none of the parents were found for any of the kinder children.
No, I don't know what the stats were. Quite a few did. Quite a few were reunited. The majority not, but a good minority were reunited. What happened to her parents was they went to Belarus and were shot. Her grandparents didn't survive even that to be shot. He died in transit, I think. They were old. They were in their 90s. So they didn't survive the journey, and her parents and the Red Cross, God bless them, informed her, did the research and informed her. And I think the information was pretty solid. It was in Minsk, and I think they were shot in Minsk. And I think that was the case. A lot of people they didn't make it to the camps to be gassed, and then there were mobile gas units in Belarus and in Minsk. But I think they were shot. So she found that out not long after the end of the war. It was after the end of the war. So I'm guessing that, I mean, there are letters. They exchanged letters prior to that, I think. Yeah, I've never spoken to her about how she received that information, if she anticipated that, or if she believed, I imagine she believed that they had survived, or hoped that hope would have manifested as a belief. So yeah, that must have been a complete hammer blow. But she had quite a life by then. She had created a world.
Yeah.
And her relationship with Germany after that, I mean, it's really interesting in terms of property, and she was in contact with, for instance, that the shop I described,
Yes.
her grandparents' shop, was a big old department store in the high street in Speyer, a sort of M&S size sort of thing. So they were it was a very bourgeois, wealthy Jewish life that they had. And when my great grandfather left, when he was taken, he said to his Aryan assistant, look after the store, which he absolutely did, in terms of it became his store. And going forward, it was given to him. And we visited twice in my life, once recently for that Steppelstone thing I described, and once before then, we visited that family who were terrified of Liesl, and made nice with her and gave us the most beautiful teas, afternoon teas, and showed us around their big house and their swimming pool. But Liesl she had a strange mixture of, I don't want to revisit that. What's done is done.
A second, but don't worry. Yeah.
Yeah.
She wasn't interested in any of that. She was happy.
She sort of was. She had a sort of, she felt the injustice of it.
Yeah.
My father, absolutely, with an eye on the prize, felt the injustice. But there were tiny payments. They were like really ridiculously small payments that the German government made, I think.
Right.
And then when we went to the Steppelstone, again, we went to visit the family. They wanted to see us. And the old woman who was the daughter of that guy, I think, was very tearful. It was weird. It was a really weird tea, because it's definitely a second and third generation, and my kids and us, we definitely weren't interested. We had no
Yes.
not I'm really not even interested in you, but I'm not here to pursue some thing. So they needed kind of reassurance of that.
Yes, yes.
Anyway, it was odd, and I haven't, it was just odd. That whole trip was very odd. Really strange. So, but we went to Germany on holiday. She had a German Catholic friend, childhood friend, who was Tante Lilo. She was a Tante. There was another Tante Agnes. So there were contacts, and we did go to the Black Forest and to Germany quite often. My dad was keen to learn German, but that was more out of intellectual interest than cultural, I think. But we didn't speak of her history until it was on Woman's Hour. So there were two things. There's the Esther Ransom thing, which you might be with Nick Winton.
Vaguely heard of it, but not really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But more importantly, and it was about, I think it was what would it have been? If Kinder was 38, it would have been in 1978. 30 and 70 is 40. 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. So the 40th anniversary of maybe the last train or the first train, anyway, random anniversary of the Kinder, a woman called Bertha Levinson, who was a Kinder transportee, went on Woman's Hour. And I think those 10,000 kids, it hadn't really spoken of it. I don't think my mother's experience was unique.
Yeah.
That they'd got on with their lives. I think they felt they'd been gifted life.
Yeah.
And they would make the most of it.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there were 10,000 stories, but
yeah.
that seems to me to be a central. That was where they all started from, maybe. But 40 years in, I think maybe they'd had families and the families had moved on, or they were just in that phase of life where you start looking at, family lineage and stuff. There was sort of people were talking about it. Kinder were talking about it. And Bertha went on to Woman's Hour. And I think she'd planned a reunion. So she said it. And of course, that demographic was listening to Woman's Hour.
Yeah.
So suddenly there was these extended families and there was a huge sort of coming together, having 40 years of sort of not a silent shame, but just silence of cracking on with it. I mean, obviously different stories again, but yes, let's have a reunion. God, yeah, let's have a reunion. So my mum went to this, and you can only imagine. They set out the tables by area, like Düsseldorf and Berlin.
Wow.
And they sat people down who had been on the same trains, who'd flown to the four corners of the UK and re-met. My God,
it's huge.
huge.
I'm beginning to cry just thinking about it. So yeah.
Yeah, no, extraordinary. And it was extraordinary for my mum. And addresses were exchanged and contacts made, and they were just sharing their experience of the world. And I think a lot of them had really buried it quite deep. So it was huge. It was a re-traumatizing, affirming, all of it. So they did the 50th one, which would have been in 88, and I went to that.
Right.
And that they didn't get any less extraordinary. No. And this time it was second generation, and I evidently am called second generation. There's a whole world of generation Kinder, which I feel no real affinity to. I don't describe myself as that.
No.
But a lot of the American, so there are a lot of American Kinder who went from the UK to America. They seem massively into that. They are really, I don't know why. Maybe it's a migrant country, and it's more common parlance. But they are very into. So I could be a member of the second generation Kinder groups, and now that first generation are dying out. They sort of they have the baton, and they're definitely happy to carry it. I'm happy to keep that memory of the event alive, but I don't feel strongly about being a second and third generation. Anna and Billy and Alpha, third generation, and there are some people who really use that as an identity, that they're third generation Kinder transport. But yeah, so the 50th anniversary, there was Prince Charles was there, and there were workshops, so it was slightly more structured than the first one. There'd obviously been a lot, but in the interim 10 years, there had been a lot of connections made. So there were poetry workshops, and I think it was the only time I felt part of that crowd. It was very hard not to.
Mm.
You know, there were lots of second generation there. We had this thing in common.
Mm.
There were interesting conversations, and there were people very emotional. And it was hard not to.
Yeah.
Why would you not want to get sucked into that? But it was definitely, for me, that was only around that event.
Mm.
And they've had a 88, 98. They had another one. Did I go to that? I think I might have even gone to that one. They were quite compelling.
Yeah.
And then there would have been, I think they might have had another one, but Liesl obviously wasn't in a position to go, and
Yes.
I certainly wouldn't have gone on my own. And then the Esther Ransom thing, just quickly, was there was a guy called Nick Winton, Sir Nicholas Winton, who only recently died, a phenomenal guy.
Is he the one who got all the children out and they made a
He got them out of Czechoslovakia, yeah.
Yeah.
And he just saw there was a need, and he was an administrator, and a really good one. And it was an administrative task, really. He had to get the families that would take them.
Yeah.
So maybe you did have to have a family that would take you. Maybe not blood family, but you had to have found
Yes.
someone prepared to take you before the government. That seems to make sense. And he got 600 kids out of Czechoslovakia just by dint of bloody mindedness and playing the administrative game and phoning and writing and doing that, and remained. And then, so that again, that was forgotten until, I guess, pretty similar period, really, 40 years in. And then Esther Ranson, on her That's Life program, invited him in to talk about it, and had one woman. It's worth looking on.
Mm-hmm.
You want to tear up.
I think there's a film just being made about it as well.
There is, with Anthony Hopkins, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Which is pretty good, actually. But so in the studio, they had one woman stood up and say, "I owe my life to Nick Winton." It's hard.
I know. Here we go. I haven't got my tissues now.
And then the entire studio audience was, and then she said, "Does anyone else here have a relationship with Nick Winton?" And the entire studio audience, with the 600, or a good number of them, and they stood up. And he hadn't really, he'd sort of moved on with his life, and that was a period of his life he didn't, and he had these kind of 600 Winton babies. And anyway, so that, I think, touches on a really interesting thing, is the culture and the mythology
Yes.
around those big traumas, and how, if you weren't primarily involved in the trauma, how you process it, and how you process it through culture, and how confusing that is in terms of an emotional response to it. Because for me, as a child growing up, I used my mother's experience as, I didn't use it all the time. It wasn't like a big obsession for me, but it was just social cachet. If the conversation was lagging, or I wanted to impress, I would say, I would drop into the conversation my mother's story. And there are echoes of that now, interestingly. So, because I didn't know how to respond to it, really. Of course, one comes and goes, and and like I said, when I was at that reunion, I felt really strongly a connection to it. And I think the loss of my grandparents, I never met them. It's funny, how do you mourn people you've never met? How do you do that? You've got nothing, you're mourning an idea.
Well, you're mourning you're mourning a sort of a yearning for that relationship, aren't you? You're mourning the fact you haven't got that relationship. Because my children have hardly known, they've only really known one grandparent properly. And I sort of feel sad that they haven't.
Yeah.
Like you say, it's a sort of rather nebulous sort of, because also if they had them, it might not have worked out. So
yeah, and also you're mourning your loss, then you're not mourning them.
No, when they're lost, but then is it? No, I think you're very interested. I think it's very interesting that it's very nuanced, because I remember looking at an article in a newspaper, and it was about people who'd survived one of the camps, and they all had such a different perception of the camp.
Mm.
And some people were quite matter of fact. They said, well, I played music and I was sort of okay. You know, it's like, it's from that to absolute despair and destruction. And I think that, you know, one of the things I was taught in one of my trainings is everybody can look at the same thing, but everyone describes it differently. You know, so, and that's even also with trauma, isn't it? Or with a perceived event. We really can look at it from all different angles. There's no one set way of looking or experiencing something.
I wonder if the Holocaust, there's a sort of exceptionalism about the Holocaust in that how unifying such an extreme
Well,
position might be.
and that's the
Yeah.
thing, isn't it, about when I was talking earlier outside before we started recording, it's like there's a national, political, international sort of sense of a journey which affects so many people, doesn't it? And then you've got that large sense of a journey and all that means and why it happened and all the result of it. Then you've got your locality and where you journey and your neighborhood and where you've moved to. And then you've got journeys within yourself of how you process things and how you do things, which changes all the time as well. So we've got all these different layers of sort of journeys and information. And I mean, this is why I wanted to talk to you, because I have no idea how one perceives it or sees it, and I'm really interested. So I'm really interested.
Yeah, I think it's a movable feast, but you know, I choose not to watch Schindler's List and stuff. I don't want to be mediated in that way. But I don't. But similarly, I don't know how to mediate it. I don't know what to make of that. I generally tend to make quite light of it. I think I tend to do that with sort of difficult situations. It's an optimism, and I'm having a sort of crisis of optimism. Really, I think optimism has served me fairly well historically. I think it might be the thing that specially kills us. You know, I think that there comes a point where optimism is counterproductive. And, you know, I think people want redemptive stories. So when they have, you know, Schindler's List, you know, Escape from Sobibor or whatever, I think the Holocaust, there's very little redemptive stuff there. There's really not. And there's certainly, in percentage terms, in terms of how it's been referred to in culture, you know, more often than not, there's a redemptive arc because that's what we do to drama and that's what we need from our stories. And I think when there are situations where there is none, we struggle. We don't know how to do that.
Yes, and I was there was a little story I came across the other day about oh, I lose my language now and have to edit it, about asking forgiveness, a bit like in South Africa, but it was done in Kosovo and it was done publicly, and people would ask forgiveness. And I always think it's very interesting because those sort of things don't get a lot of exposure, really, because in a way the actual story is just tragic. There isn't redemption in it. It's a very tragic story. The redemption maybe comes later with like the bricks you were saying, and the people and the next generation, and how we then look at what happened and go, we mustn't let that happen again, which is so questionable when we look at our world now. But so I think it's further down the line sometimes, and it's a bigger picture, and again it's a bigger picture thing. And because it's not so emotionally charged and dramatic, we don't tend to hear those stories. And I'm very interested in those stories. So for example, my old dance teacher, his first major, he did one show, and then the first major theatre show was called Rückblick, Flashback, and it was about Kathy Kollwitz, who was a socialist artist in sort of pre-Nazi or Nazi Germany. And it was like his sort of I don't know, I wouldn't like to put the words in it, but I think he felt he needed to do that because he was German. He needed to make that piece of theatre. Yeah, I have no answers. I'm just really interested.
No, I mean, I think in 1972, you could have sort of made an argument for, you know, the German psyche having, you know, really put the hard yards in and doing some heavy lifting on redeeming some redemptive efforts, but and you know, in fairness, that continues, and you know, there have been reparations and the Stones and this very performative contrition that we experienced.
Yeah.
You know, and the whole town very keen to tell us that they were, you know, they used the Jewish shops and it was a terrible thing that happened. Um, I don't know, you know, I mean, this is done under, you know, we're talking under the shadow of genocide in Gaza, so you know, it's hard to see a larger redemptive arc in that, you know, and it's hard not to see, and I know it's dodgy ground and all that, but it's hard not to see the abused being an abuser. It's hard not to see that trope playing out.
I know, and that's the thing that I always find really, that's tragically sad, but that's quite often when trauma hasn't been addressed, isn't it? It's very interesting. People talk about trauma so much now, psychology and everything, and it's like, you know, just because ill is done to you does not mean to say that that will stop you doing ill to someone else. We sort of think it will, but sometimes that scarring and that that
Well, the
hurt.
taboo has been broken in a way. You've witnessed the taboo being broken. And I think those taboos take a long time to build. They're there for almost Darwinian reasons, and you know, maybe I'm not qualified to have an opinion really, but maybe they maybe if you've witnessed the taboo being broken, it's harder to, I don't know, I mean, I really don't know.
It's a very specialized area, but I'm just wondering, so when your mum saw that thing on or heard it on Women's Hour, did it change how she looked at it? Do you know? I mean, it's hard to know, isn't it? Because that generation were quite private. They're not necessarily going to talk to you about it. But how did that affect her then?
Yeah, no, absolutely did. That was the marker. That was
Yes,
when,
that was
okay, we can talk about this now.
yeah,
So she, and people will listen.
yes.
Importantly, I think.
People are
So
interested.
she wrote. People started to write books. There's a book called "They Came Alone," I think, in which she has her story is told.
Yeah.
I think that might have been Bertha's book actually. Maybe Bertha was. No, I think, but maybe Bertha was soliciting stories for a book.
Mm.
Anyway, yeah, and then she went and taught, as you rightly said, she spoke in schools about her experience,
Yeah.
really eloquently and movingly. I went to one so she moved down here in 2000 to Milo and spent
Yeah.
the last years of her life, sort of long years. She died when she was 98. So,
Oh wow.
yeah, a couple of years ago. So she's carried on that here. She had a little flirtation. She wasn't religious or wasn't a practicing Jew certainly, and didn't renounce it, but she'd kind of done with it through her life. And then when she got down here, the local Jewish community, she was a sort of minor celebrity by virtue of being a kinder. So
Yeah.
they were very, once they discovered her, and she'd been on the radio a bit and at schools, she was kind of courted by them. So she wasn't a dalliance, but she sort of just socially, and then I think she found it all a bit Jewish, uh, and then sort of stepped back a bit from it. But yeah, so she was very voluble about it after that, and especially after the reunion. Yeah, it was. Let's talk about it.
Yes.
And we'd been surrounded with objects, so it wasn't like it was you were what, you know,
Mm.
wow. It
Mm.
was, yeah. So it was talked about in the family. It was hard. Yeah, it wasn't like it wasn't suppressed, but it just wasn't. You know, there were lots of other things on. You know, we
Yeah.
had O levels, and we had, you know, and we were staying out late and drinking clan dew. You know, it just wasn't top of the list to talk about. You know, when you get up in the morning. But yeah, after that, it was kind of after me and my sister had left home mostly, which was probably true of that generation,
Mm.
and they just had time,
Mm.
and the trauma, however it was processed by them, had done its work and worked itself out a bit, maybe. So yeah, I think they all chatted. It was much more in the public discourse.
Yes.
And she spoke about it to whoever would listen, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And still fairly positive about it. I mean,
I don't think she was allowed to be. No, she wasn't
not allowed
allowed
to be positive. No. So what was her sort of? If I'd gone to a talk of hers, what would I have heard? I would have heard the reasons, the sort of what was happening in Germany, and where did she sort of start? Where did she aim her talk?
No, she didn't really put it in a broader political context. That wasn't her jam. It
So
was
she did
much more personal.
private.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think one of her motivations, I hadn't really considered it, but would have been to honour her parents. She wrote you might have remember it at the end of Transports, which was the play we did. She read a poem on film, which was about her parents. I mean, she wrote Doggerel. That was how she processed trauma. She put everyone else through the trauma of listening to her Doggerel.
Doggerel, brilliant.
On everything, and I love it. But and she famously, my niece Hannah was visiting her when she was in her sort of late mid-20s, and Liesl, I think, was getting a little demented possibly, but Liesl was reading her some poems, and there are lots of them. There are books of this dog, and so every the dog going to the vet would elicit a paean to the vet and in doggerel, and so Hannah had been listening to a couple of volumes of this, and then Liesl said, do you want to listen to some more? And Hannah, being a good girl, said, oh yes please, Granny. Liesl said, say please. It was like the Vogons torturing whoever it was. And anyway, so what was I saying?
It's that her talks were personal, private, sort of honouring her parents.
She was a good storyteller, and she made friends very quickly, and people responded to it. I think that's what made her a survivor. And maybe that was a skill learnt, or maybe it was innate. But she could make friends very, very quickly, and she would keep them. So, like, if she took a train ride, really interesting actually, specifically train ride, she 9 times out of 10 she'd have engaged a stranger, quite possibly told that stranger her story, not in a kind of big me eye, but she'd go deep really fast, really fast, and people, in spite of themselves, would respond. She would come back with names and addresses on a train and be in contact with those people, and not, I think I'm right in saying, visit them. They would be moved to tears by her, and I don't know if that's a potency. I don't know how. It wasn't willfully. I don't want to suggest that she used that, but it was a mechanism to make connections.
I think I remember reading about a totally different thing, but a lovely man who was a Russian emigre, and apparently he would sit on the train and just say to people, this was some years ago, I don't know if you get away with this now, he'd say, like, what's your experience with your guardian angel? Well, if you go deep quick, you get some sort of, it does, people also, I think, sometimes feel quite honoured that you feel able to travel with it. There are things, I've got some of my family go deep quick, and it is interesting because it does elicit a very strong and often a very genuine response.
Yeah, I think you either say thank you but no thank you, and
you either sort of move quietly,
or you don't. So if you ask enough people, you're going to get a fairly good hit rate.
And I think also, this, like me being nosy, isn't it? We are interested in people, and we are interested in people who've had a different experience and how they have navigated that different experience. So that is a fascinating thing. I
mean, I think it's only social mores that, the person who said to, when Liesl said, oh, hello, that's an interesting book you're reading, or some sort of slightly cross the line sort of, wow, may have said thank you but no thank you and gone back to their interesting book, but they quite likely went home, went on Netflix and decided to investigate a fictional world of somebody else. So they had the innate interest in other lives and other worlds. They just didn't want the social anxiety of it, a visceral experience. My mum had no boundaries on the visceral experience. She would go straight in there. So it made her a very good storyteller. And when she went into schools, when she spoke to 14-year-old girls about her experience, they were in pieces.
Yes.
They were in pieces. And she didn't, I sort of, as a theatre maker, I quite like that. I have a quite a usury relationship. I drink tears. I love it. I mean, I think that's a measure of success.
Whether you've moved your audience to tears,
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
like, come on, tears. We've success, darling.
Yeah, laugh, cry. Hey, come on. So, but I have a more professional sort of relationship with that in a way. I mean, it makes me sound very cold and callous. But I hope I'm not. But I don't think Liesl had that. She wanted to respect her parents, give her parents. She wanted to understand, I think, how, as she became a parent herself, what that moment, that foundational moment on the station, what it meant. That became more and more in focus as she became a parent. So she had this truncated 14-year relationship, maybe 12 conscious, 10 conscious years with her parents. And she wanted some sort of peace with that, I think. And I think talking to schools and talking to young girls.
I didn't realise she was doing 14-year-olds, and that's, of course, very poignant because that's her age and she left.
Yeah.
So that would really hit in at a very strong...
Yeah, I think it was around that sort of GCSE level.
Yeah, no, that's
young girls. And it was like rock star territory, after they would sort of flock round her, and then she'd always get 30 little drawings and letters from them. And I mean, she was good value. That's a good trip. That's a good school chat. That one. That's kind of Seal Sanctuary. Yeah, maybe, but a bit of Holocaust kinder transport.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember people that have told me things like that. It sits in the brain. It stays there. You register.
Yeah. But again, it is mythologizing. It is cathartic. And that's all it can be, and that's all we have. We don't want a first-hand experience of that. We want it mediated. We want to make sense of it.
So did she know when you and Jude started with others, Falmouth and Penryn Welcome Refugees, was Liesl still alive, or had she died by then?
No, she was alive, right on. So it's 7 years. No, she was alive. How conscious she was of that, it wasn't
about it.
Wasn't really. No. No. I mean, at this point, I would say it was absolutely Jude drove that forward. There was a nice conference, was it, that when Liesl moved into care at Langham over the road here in Falmouth, that left us with an empty house.
Yes.
Which we sold, and then bought a more appropriate house in Falmouth that received our first family who came from Syria. Actually, or Jordan, maybe. I think they'd already left Syria. So that felt like a very nice circle squared. That although Liesl wasn't in a position to know that,
but she would have
that she would have absolutely been behind that. So we could charge a nominal, a much cheaper than market rent for that house, which was Liesl's estate. So I was happy that she would be happy to do that, and that felt really lovely. And weirdly, I went up to meet that family at Manchester Airport, I think, and the plane that landed before the one that came from Damascus was from Düsseldorf. Yeah. So that was odd. But yeah, so they walked through the gate into their new life, fleeing whatever horrors they were fleeing. So that felt very appropriate. I had it made all those decisions very easy. Certainly.
Yes. Yes, so I suppose that's what I was intrigued by, because I remember talking to Jude, because I think she and I had both gone online to look at all these different places where you could offer to give somebody a room and all these things. Just so difficult, or they weren't down here, and it was like, what do you do if you want to respond? So it was brilliant, that the response that
Yeah, no, it was born out of a kind of helplessness that you couldn't. What can you actually do?
Yes.
And it's a bit of a weird thing. It's the community sponsorship. I don't know how. So it's when, if you can raise, so it's a community sponsorship group. If you can raise £9,000 and put accommodation in place and language education, someone to help with navigate the benefit system, and you need degree level help with that. And so healthcare, education. So there's quite a lot to put in place, and then the Home Office say yes, you can do that, and then the UNHCR, United Nations Refugee Council thing, go and pick this kind of Willy Wonka golden ticket family. So it is weird. I mean, it's such a finger in the dike, but they're real people, and what are you going to do? And they're also importantly, because there was, like, with the Syrian war, there was, like, kinder transport, hadn't crossed my mind before, but there was a finite number of people that the government would let in, but community sponsorship was on top of that.
Okay.
So you weren't just doing the government's job; you were actually allowing another family to escape and to try to start a new life. That for me, and I think for Jude, knowing Liesl as she did, that felt like it wasn't the only motivating factor by any means, but the fact that Liesl could help, even if she wasn't aware of that, we know for a fact she'd have been right behind that one. And that was lovely. That was really genuinely lovely.
Gosh, wow. Okay, so what do I need to ask you? What else is there? What do I need to say? Is there anything else you want to say? That's the other thing. I'm always intrigued by.
No, I feel like I've dumped quite a lot. It's ongoing.
Yes. Where's your ongoing? Because it's an ongoing conversation, isn't it? People migration, how we should support each other, the atrocities that are going on in our world at the moment, which are just hard to comprehend, really.
And the narrative that the refugees and asylum seekers are the root of all evil, and
yes, which is, and the statistics which are bandied around, and the numbers which are so often unclear and wrong, and how you name people. You're a refugee, you're an asylum seeker. It's like that you're that before you're a person who needs help and who needs refuge and who needs asylum. But and
also how easy it is to, you and Peter and family are unusually kind, but what levels of kindness you have to welcome people whose lives are very different, whose values are different, whose culture is different, and so with my history of experience of Liesl's story, I really have to. I'm not a natural. I have to. When I meet refugees, and I've and obviously I have a lot to do with a lot of people, I'm fine. I see their humanity. I see their struggles. I can forgive me and them anything, and it's there. I've only got to be away from them in front of me, and I'm, as much as anyone, I'm susceptible to the background noise of me first, Britain first, America great again. That it's so pervasive.
And it's so bizarre, isn't it? And I think, when I lived in London at one point, I turned around and I thought, I'm very happy. And I looked around and realized that I was living in a really international household. And I know that I have I particularly like being around diversity.
Mm.
That's one of the things I find quite satisfying. Um, but I don't. But it is hard. And we've had people stay with us for just very short times, and when there isn't very good language, and when they've got problems and trauma, we weren't able. I think we had a Latvian family, just a mother and son, for a short time, and we had another Latvian lady at one point, and we couldn't. She was quite unwell, and we didn't have the time and the capacity to support her because, like I say, you need a lot of support to support the NHS,
Mm.
and she ended up going back.
Mm.
I don't. It's really difficult, isn't it? Because and there are so many ways of looking at it, and I don't know so much now, but I mean, I've travelled enough to know that even with our broken NHS and our broken education system, it's a lot more than many places have.
Mm.
So there's still that attraction for a lot of people, to come here. But then, so I'm just warbling off now because sometimes
Yeah,
why
but I think
come to a country that's not always kind to you. Sometimes
mm.
it's kind to people, and sometimes it isn't. It's so multifaceted, isn't it? I
But I
don't.
think going forward, I think the refugee thing, it won't happen, but I think it would need to be reframed that there
Yeah.
will be a, more people fleeing more things, and it will affect upon your life, but you're okay. You may not be. You may feel neglected and sort of screwed over by the globalization or whatever, but we are just going to have to muck in. You are going to have to shove up.
Shut up.
Easy to say.
Be comfy. Yeah, other
Yeah,
people. Yeah,
and
and share
it
space.
won't be. You may not be able to sustain everything you've known and loved, and you could rationalize that by saying, look at your colonial history.
Mm,
That doesn't really cut it, but you really should.
yeah.
Um,
Well, we have
look,
a lot of reparation to make on that, don't we? And a lot of
we
repentance.
really do, and we're not gonna make those reparations in financial terms. I know Jamaica is just pursuing that, but we can make reparations by, we're 20th in Europe
It's not
in
high, is it?
in in, in how many per capita refugees we take. We want our lives to be unchanged. I mean, in a changing world, of course, the reactionary impulse is really strong. It's not going to happen. You have to sort of be honest about that. And I think the Germans were, the Norwegians, a lot of the Scandinavian countries were. They were saying, we're going to have to suck this up. This is partly down to us, and I think the Germans did it. It's only just struck me, but they have a history of contrition from the Second World War, so it's kind of easier to have those conversations about colonialism and a debt owed and a responsibility for chaoses around the world. I read a really slightly left field, but it's stuck with me. I was reading Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, and she referenced another writer who I can't remember, um, who had this idea of a doppelganger, another sort of doppelganger. And in the first world, in the global north, we all have this kind of, she described it as this kind of floating, slightly Studio Ghibli, grotesque doppelganger that floats around or inhabits the global south, that takes the lithium and everything that's in B&Q and on Amazon
I know.
and all those resources, and sort of, and we know that's there. If to varying degrees of awareness, we know we have this responsibility. Every time we click buy now,
Yeah.
we know there's a cost to that that's
And
invisible to
renew
us.
our mobile phones because it's just not
Yeah,
quite up to scratch.
yeah, all of that. So, but we all have this doppelganger, this kind of malign
Yeah.
doppelganger some degree or other. And I just find that such a potent image. And it does relate, I think, to why we should change the narrative around migration.
Yes.
That it may get quite sticky,
Yeah.
and of course you can make the argument about that migrants are a net economic gain, and that multiculturalism brings huge diversity, which is all true. But I think you can't always frame it as a positive. You have to frame the the sharing and the fundamental kindness of sharing. You have to even if that doesn't work at a kind of macro level, personally, you have to keep reminding yourself of that there may well be a cost, but it's one you have to pay for
And I think that's about being ordinary, isn't it? And that's about seeing our neighbour as ourselves, and what would you like people to do for you if you're in that situation? The fact
Yeah.
that we're in a situation of privilege and we're not fleeing our home, well, lucky old us. But
Yeah.
what about all the other people who are, as a neighbour, as a person in community? Don't you want to try to do something about that? And it's
Yeah.
not that we can make everything good, but I think we can definitely try to be human in that sense of being a community. And I also think there's some I've forgotten their name now, but there's a very good organization, and it just talks about how you frame it and how you say it.
Yeah.
That most people, and when they do polls, we get these awful polls that are anti everything. But actually, when you do polls, most people still rate kindness and generosity and caring for others. Most people still actually have those. So actually, if you talk about it in the right way, you're being kind, you're being generous, you're caring for others, you could get a lot more people alongside you. So I do think a lot of it is that we just don't have the right words being used. And I had a mother who's just said, you have to say people first. And I think, a person who's fleeing, a person who needs refuge, a person who's seeking asylum, and that they're ordinary people. They're not special and they're going to make our lives wonderful. And they're not terrible and they're going to stigmatize us. It's just an ordinary person struggling and struggling.
Yeah.
We are. So we should. And I do.
Yeah. No, I think the ordinary person story is really important to tell, because the horrors that are foisted on the world aren't foisted by ordinary people. They're foisted by this tiny megalomaniacal patriarchy, really. I mean, they literally are. That's what's coming very clearly into focus, is that most people just want to get on and do their thing. And there are some people who are psychotically want that not to happen for reasons that baffle me, really.
Well, I do think I have to edit this bit out, but I do think it's I've gone to, someone said that Greta Thunberg doesn't get much publicity anymore because she started attacking capitalism. While she was just a sort of teenager talking about eco stuff, everyone was sort of quite, that's interesting, isn't it? Sweet, sort of, it's inspiration porn, as they call it. Once you get a bit older and you're saying, well, actually, it's the whole way that it's set up. Everything's set up for profit. So even if you try to do something, it's very hard to get out of the mindset or get out of the whole thing, which is set up for profit. And if you have profit and you have to have shareholders who make more money, people have to make more money, then you're going to exploit people. And you're going to exploit the people in the global south or whatever. And you're not listening. As soon as you're not listening to the vulnerable voices, you're losing a large and important part of the conversation. So they're just being shouted out, really. And it appeals to all of us. We appeal, people go like, oh yes, I believe in that, but this was really cheap. And you're going, it was cheap because, but you can't stop people buying cheap because they might not have enough money. So it's up to governments, I think, now to do
a lot. Check your doppelganger. I think that's why that image is so strong. Yeah, and I think, I mean, it is. I don't think you should edit it out, because I think that any discussion about refugees,
I'll keep it in,
has to, is fundamental to discussions about broader issues of capital, use of capital. And
I think funny now, I was listening to something the other day. What was it I was listening to? Oh, we're trying to understand about how much energy AI generated might use. And I was listening to something about it, and I was talking to my daughter and saying, like, honestly, that's where donut economics comes in. It's like you can hardly look at anything these days in isolation. You've got to look at everything surrounding it. Because if you look at, we're so used to looking at things very linearly, and if that works, then we'll do that, and then that'll make that happen. And all these things that shake off on the side and impact it, we forget about. And then they come around to bite us, on the heel, if you like. And suddenly we go like, oh, well, we should have thought about that. Oh dear, now we're in a bit of a problem. We need to start thinking very holistically, about all of these problems.
Anyway. Yeah, and then you have yes, you absolutely do. And then you have the chaos, which doesn't allow that rational, holistic discussion. You just have bombs dropping and getting out. And that's what, I mean, just, it's interesting in terms of the community sponsorship experience is that from chaos, from people plucked from unimaginable, well, actually described quite imaginable chaos. They tend not to be in refugee camps. They tend to be living in cities, but under some, in pretty tricky situations. They come to the UK and the community sponsorship, and then everything is bound in by safeguarding, and it's this. I mean, it's really interesting, apropos nothing almost, but that how cosseted and safeguarded these people suddenly are when they're under the umbrella of the Home Office and community sponsorship groups. That we spend so much time discussing the minuenti of safeguarding and and these are people who've just been barely getting by, and then they're in this world where and it's kind of weird. You can sort of see, I absolutely see the why of it, but the actual practice of it is quite odd and quite discombobulating for them, I think.
I could imagine, because it's not even a gradual transition, is it? It's your
sort
of
suddenly
into almost feels like overprotection, but it's just people trying to really make sure it will work. I mean,
and you're dealing with biometric ID and 1,000 forms to fill in, and really hard to process for them.
Well, I'm good. So one of my next conversations is with a friend, Sophia, and I have a feeling, I've got to check it with her, but I think some of their family fled Syria. So she's half Syrian. Her father's from Syria, Aleppo, and they live in England. She's got an English mother. Some of his family, I think, fled to Germany, and some are still there, and I think some went back to Aleppo.
Yeah.
So it's like, and that has to happen as well, doesn't it? Because sometimes you'd rather, and his parents went back to Aleppo, even though they were in danger. They'd rather be with all their family there.
Yeah.
So it's not a. It's like nothing is one size fits all.
Yeah. Well, I think that speaks to no names, no pack drill sort of thing. But I think some of the families, the parental generation, feel like they're sacrificial. They've come for their kids.
Yes.
Their kids are fine. Their kids are little Cornish. Some of them have been born in Cornwall, and they're just cracking on, doing what kids do, learning the language. And parents, I don't know. I think for some of them, it's never going to happen. The idea of integration is such a weird. It's not simple. Integration isn't a simple idea.
No, and you have to allow people to be how they want to be, don't you? And it quite often, yes, when you hear lots of stories, it's for the children, isn't it? It's for their safety.
Which I guess brings us neatly back to that railway station.
Yes, exactly. And I know some Ukrainian families that are like that. It's a good life for their children here. They miss home. That it's hard. Yeah. Well, yes. Thank you.
So, yeah.
Yes, back to the railway station and the trauma and the parents doing it for their children and all of that. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't. I can't understand what we're seeing in Gaza these days.
No, it's extraordinary, and no, I mean that our government can feel that they can admonish someone for shouting something in response to the murder of children and not admonish the murder of children is Orwellian. I mean, it's fucking Orwellian. So, I don't think that's nuanced.
No, I think we just say it. I think it's all right. It's just a podcast. We just say it as we feel it. And I wish I had a sort of more educated. I don't
think you don't need an educated. It's important not to. I think it's important to have an emotional response to that, because.
And I think for me, it is that thing as well, isn't it? That politics are politics, and it's complicated. I understand, territories and geography and people's heritages and everything are difficult, but in the end, people are people, and if you break the rules and if you kill children, bomb people that shouldn't be bombed. It's not right.
Yep, I think we can safely say
That's not.
that's the case. Oh yeah.
Oh dear. Oh,
That,
thank
yeah,
you.
that used not to be a contentious idea.
I know. Well, it just. Oh, I think the other thing I feel really difficult about these days is like where you get your news from. I mean, that's a whole
Yeah.
other subject, isn't it? Where you get your news from, what gets put out on as news,
Yeah.
how even people that you think are trying to be non-biased, you start hearing their language, and they're not unbiased. They're trying to sensationalize it. They're trying to get a story. They're trying to sort of get you really upset and engaged. And
But it's funny, isn't it? I mean, with regard to like the classic argument for the BBC that it's that it doesn't have a bias. It reports the news, and I've stopped really using it as a resource because of that. I'm not interested in non-bias now.
I know what do you
I think if people are, I don't want to hear the argument for bombing kids. I don't want to hear a counter argument to that. Don't want to hear it. And if that's what constitutes a neutral position, then fuck, I don't want to hear that. I really don't. I will then go to my echo chamber. Thank you very much.
Well, I heard somewhere, and I'm not going to say it exactly because I probably would say it wrong, but that when people are trying to get a counter argument, so like say you have a lot of people have one idea, and they would get somebody who had a counter argument who had a very small following. So
Yeah.
actually, you're constantly giving airtime to someone who has a tiny following because you're thinking you're giving both sides of the argument. Actually, you're building that person a platform that they don't really have. You need to have someone who's not quite as extreme, but they were giving this person a lot of airtime, and I don't see that as a balanced.
Well, I guess when the world becomes extreme, when the center doesn't hold, and the world becomes extreme, then just in terms of physics, the balances are on the extremes. So if you have climate breakdown, that's an extreme thing, undeniably. So if you're schooled in balance, then the literal balance of that will be on the counter extreme. So it's a function of extremities, I think, of extreme situations, and yeah. So no, it's where you get one's information. I mean, I'm mercifully off. I don't have social media or anything like that, so I'm not privy to that algorithm. But I read the Guardian like assiduously and much to cover to cover. So I guess that's my social. It's another social media by any other name, I suppose.
I think we've touched on it lightly, but I've got some friends who've mentioned it a few times, and I'm going, and people that I respect, and I'm going like, "Ow, that's hard," and that is coming, which is that climate breakdown is going to cause people to need asylum, to need refuge, to move, to migrate.
Yeah.
Just by extreme heat and extreme weather, and we're not even prepared for that, and we've seen it beginning it already. So that's a whole other sort of world of opening up, isn't it? Anyway.
Yeah.
Well.
Yes.
Oh no! Oh, thank you. Though it's nice to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, nice to rabble on.
Yeah. All right.
No, it's interesting. Since you mentioned it, I've been thinking primarily about how I use it. How I find it difficult to know how to respond to that story.
Yes.
And and I hadn't really realized, like 2 weeks ago, I did a quiz on migration
Oh
for
really?
Refugee Week.
Yeah.
And I had and it was kind of
Oh,
stand up meets TED Talk sort of thing.
Mm.
And I did a kinder transport round, and talked about Sound of Music, and sort of made not quite light of it, but framed it like a pub quiz. Yeah. I think I've sort of been doing that all my life, sort of using it for infotainment if I'm generous, entertainment if I'm not.
Yeah.
And maybe that's how I process it. Maybe that's.
Well, I've got my friend Eileen who's died now, but she was German Jewish heritage, and she went back towards the end of her life and visited one of the concentration camps and found her aunt who died in the concentration camp, who was called Ingi. And so Eileen just put her name within her name. So after that, she was always Eileen Ingi Hertzberg. And I just thought that was interesting. She's a very non-political person. It's just, but she was deeply moved to do that. And I've got another artist, sort of acquaintance friend, and he went back. He's so his mother was South African and left South Africa, but they're Jewish heritage. And he went into the forest that surrounds some of the camps, and he made it was a spectacular image. Actually, he made all these chairs that were covered in camouflage, sort of like material or sticky camouflage material, and he stacked them one on top of the other, so at least 4 or 5 up, and then he set them on fire. It was a statement of, although all that lineage didn't happen, or those people died, their sort of lineage stopped, But obviously, kinder transport is different because it carried on, so there's a different narrative, a different story, isn't there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what you do with it, really. You do what you do, don't you? And
well, I think it's good to say. I think it's very good sometimes to talk about things that aren't finished, are they? They're not close. They're just they're a dynamic which ebbs and flows and changes and is relevant. But yes, how do we? I don't think we do know always what to do.
Well, except to end possibly on a, I've always, my sister and I, get this is quite weird. Yeah. I don't normally put this in the public domain, but we had a ping pong table in our garden, and we used to play ping pong and do rallies, and we used to so it wasn't really competitive. We just see how many we could do, because that was ping pong, and we would do it. So if we dropped the ball, that was a Jew we hadn't saved. So it must have gone pretty fucking deep for us. That, and that sounds terrible, but it was just, that was a familial thing. It was this sort of.
I think that's fascinating, because we had, and this is a really weird one, which I sometimes say to people, but it's so sort of odd. So people who know me, my brother's a wildlife filmmaker, and we had lots of pets as children. And when we started off with our first lot of pets, it was still okay to have tortoises. So we had these tortoises, and they were always called Fred. Now, my grandfather committed suicide when my father was 14, and he was called Fred. Every single tortoise got called Fred. Why? It's just strange, isn't it? And I didn't even know his name. It's strange.
Debunks it, demystifies it, de-terrifies it.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I don't know. I mean, we had some long rallies. Concentrates the mind. I can tell you.
Fantastic. Hundreds, I hope. Hundreds.
Yeah. But so anyway, to leave on a positive, I think it felt like every moment of joy feels like a victory.
Yes.
And a slap in the face for fascism.
Yes.
So that, although it's not finished, it continues, and the continuum is a victory of sorts, is a redemption of sorts.
And that's where you talked about optimism, which I do think, even in the face of difficulty, that optimism, even if it's optimism of the human spirit in the face of adversity, is important.
That's what we're told, and that's what yes, I still believe that.
Yeah, I still believe that.
But I think it's I think it's a double-edged sword. I think it can be used to put your head in the sand.
Yeah. No, but I think your thing for joy, I think every time we choose joy, every time we act positively, that is sort of the only way we can go.
Yeah. It's it feels like a radical act sometimes.
I think it's a radical act. Yeah, they say joy is a radical act. We'll leave it on that one.
Yeah. Okay, sweet.
Thanks a lot, Al.
Yeah. See you both soon.
See you soon.
Love.
Bye.
Bye.